Hey guys, today we are going to talk about why the T206 Honus Wagner is so valuable and sought after, as well as some history behind the T206 set in general. Stay tuned. Hello to all my sports card collector, investor, all of my collectibles friends out there in the universe. How are you doing? It is Saturday. I hope everyone is having a great weekend so far. Today I'm going to be talking about kind of a fun subject here, the T206 baseball card set, and I'm going to reference one of my good hobby friends, Ryan McClanahan. He has a website, historythroughcards.com. I will put a link in the video description so you can check it out. But Ryan, I would consider him a sports card historian, a researcher. Fantastic information and really a deep dive into a lot of different subjects related to sports cards. And when I say deep dive, I'm talking about a deep dive. He really goes into a lot of research. He's been doing it for years and years, and his work is tremendous. And so I want to bring light to it and share. And so this is one of the articles from his site. It is 50 pages long, and it's titled The Rise of T206. Again, 50 pages long, but it's really kind of going through the history of the time. So it's American history tied to sports card history and how it all intertwines. And it's very interesting when you just look at the economics back then, kind of what folks were going through and so forth. And then you kind of tie in cards to that. It really kind of gives you a nice visual, an understanding of why things were and how they've come to be. So definitely check out his site, historythroughcards.com. And again, it's Ryan McClanahan. I did have him on my show May 17th, 2021. I did a live stream with him. Check that out. I'll look to put a link in the video description as well for that live stream. That was a good time. Right off the bat in this article, I like how Ryan kind of ties in the fact that the game of baseball as it is today, very different than the way it was played previously, going back, 100 years. They were playing with gloves like this. This is a glove that I picked up. Actually, I met a dealer at the National that had a bunch of antiques and a bunch of cool sports memorabilia stuff. But if you look at this glove, it's like, how did anybody play baseball with this glove? Obviously, the ball was different, the glove was different, the bats were different, everything was different, and the game was more based on strategy than it was on power and speed as the game is played today. And these cards made back then, they were tied to tobacco companies. We'll get into that a little bit later. But the T206, I'm going to read this kind of straight from the article because I think it's just best read simply from that. The T206 is the alphanumeric designation given to the set by Jefferson Burdick sometime around 1946, though prior to that, it was simply known as set number 521. A decade prior, it was set SS 1936, and if you go back far enough to the time that they were distributed, they were simply referred to as picture cards, as the term baseball cards had not been used yet. Baseball card collecting was not a thing. And again, we will get into that a little bit later as well, because I think that's an important part of the story. The Honus Wagner T206 record-breaking sale, $6+ million sale here this year in 2021 of this sale. And how did we get here? Was Honus Wagner that big of a star? Actually, he was. According to the article, if we go back in 1907, he was one of the highest paid baseball players, making $5,000. $12,000 in 1909, and then the year after, he made $18,000. And according to the article, he was in the top 10 stats-wise for the 16 of his 21 seasons playing baseball. So Honus Wagner, although maybe didn't have as much fanfare as Babe Ruth or a Cy Young or a Ty Cobb, he was a big-time player. He was a star, and he did not want his name tied to the tobacco cards. He was not for it. It was being marketed in a way that young people were getting involved, and he didn't like that. So they ended up pulling his cards, and that's part of the reason why there is kind of the scarcity around it. But these were not these were mass produced for the time period, and it wasn't uncommon for them to be scattered along the roadway. Nobody really cared about them. Let's just put it out there like that. These first cards, nobody was really paying attention. And so because they were so easily discarded, made them more scarce. And then of course, you hear about the 50s baseball cards that were put in bike spokes, and that's why they became scarce. It's kind of the same sort of idea where people just didn't care. They didn't care about these cards, these picture cards. And so to find them at all is great, but then also to find them in good condition is especially rare because of the fact that just nobody cared about them. And that kind of sums up, I think, collectibles as a whole. For something to be collectible and valuable down the road, we do talk about kind of mass-produced collectibles. Very, very difficult for something to be very rare or scarce when it's mass-produced, and then people already have it in their mind that they are going to collect this thing. If it's labeled a collectible, it probably won't be valuable down the road. That's the way I kind of look at it. If it is one of these collectible boxes or collectible whatever it is, people will probably hold on to that as a collectible, and it won't be scarce because people will have held on to it. What makes it really scarce is people just didn't care about it. Then years, and in this case, decades later, people start caring about it. There's a really cool picture in this article too about the different factories that made these cards and how they were stamped back then to track sales, track orders. But each factory kind of has its own unique, parallel to these cards, if you will. So there are 524 known base cards in this set, but there's also variations based on the factory, the way that I understand this. So it's not as if there's just 524 base cards. This is kind of the parallel of the day. I really like how also his article has a picture of an advertisement, and it's from September 18th, 1909, and it's in Sporting Life magazine, and it does show it's the first series of these cards. The 150 series is what they called it, and it does have the Honus Wagner card there. So there was advertising back there for this, and this was basically the American Tobacco Company commissioned the American Lithograph Company to produce these sets, these sports card sets. But again, it was not something that people really collected, and or if they did, they were just lost in time. Nobody, it didn't pass down. I think the one thing too that the article points out that is really great is Jefferson Burdick, the guy that kind of really got this whole thing going, didn't really start paying attention or writing about this until the late 30s, 1930s. So if you're looking at, this is a set from 1909, so you literally have 25 plus years where, there's a lot of lost data in this mix. There's a lot of lost information. And if you think back to the time period, it's not as if everybody was living to be 80, 85, 90 years old where you have, the 90-year-old is going back, yes, I remember these cards. No, it was literally people were living to like 40s, 50s, 60s was more common. You were living a long life if you got into your 70s back in 1909, so there wasn't really a lot of information passed down. There wasn't the internet to be able to throw something into the web, the World Wide Web, and for people to find that later on. So there's a lot of lost information, and Jefferson admits that himself, just doing his own research, is that he's trying to fit in the pieces as he wrote for different columns. He came up with the first checklist in the early 1940s for sports cards. But again, think about that. First checklist, early 1940s. And then, of course, you have the war that came up after that. So I'm sure that was a distraction, from all this stuff. And so then you get into the 50s and 60s, and you start having more columns written about cards, and it continues on. But it wasn't a boom time. It wasn't as if like the 40s happened and everyone was collecting cards. Even getting into the 50s and 60s, it was kind of stagnant growth if we're talking about a collector base. And then, of course, as time goes on, it morphed into more of the baseball card, sports card collecting space that we know today. But it was a slow grind. It was a slow growth, for this thing to happen. And so my take on this is when you look at that Honus Wagner and you look at that particular set and the set's kind of around that time period, and then also just as we progress on to the late 40s, the 50s and the 60s baseball cards and just sports cards in general, people, when they get into a certain hobby, they want to understand the origins of it. They want to understand, what were the first sets? How did this all begin? And it comes back to these tobacco sets, going back to, the early 1900s. And there was lots of different sets. It's just this 1909 set is an important one in particular. And then, of course, you have the story around Honus Wagner and stories, great stories over time. And then, of course, you've got American history that's tied to it as well. And just kind of the tobacco companies and how they were very, very powerful for a long time. And then how that kind of changed over time. And so I would say definitely check this out. It's a long read. It's 50 pages from Ryan, but it's fantastic because it really goes into some heavy detail, everybody that was kind of involved in that time. And he's looking to get into kind of some of the more behind the scenes stories and tying it all together. And so if you're looking to just kind of understand more about the history of sports cards and some of his takes on it, I think it's great, especially if you are a vintage collector or vintage card collector, or if you're looking to understand more about vintage and the history behind the cards. This is a great spot. This is a great website for that. And I think that's the big thing. When you hold vintage cards in your hand, you're holding a piece of history. So you have to understand you are kind of antique shopping, if you will. But these are very special antiques. Because they're sports cards that are also antiques in some cases, and they will over time become antiques. When we talk about 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s baseball cards, these aren't 100-year-old cards yet, but they will be one day. And so these are pieces of history, that we have in this piece of cardboard, and that is what makes them important. And I think that's what makes them amazing. Let me know your thoughts as well on this. I appreciate you guys tuning in. We will have more kind of reviews of Ryan's articles. I want to bring more of his work to light because just a great individual and also just knows his stuff, frankly. An amazing weekend, guys. Stay healthy, stay awesome. I will talk to you again later.